A privilege for me to be here. Pastor Emeritus. Emeritus means when there's a holiday, you're on call. So I'm glad to be here on the holiday. Also, Tim Thompson is a very, very smart person. I'm preaching today on a game plan. I know his game plan. He must have drawn it up for Auburn last night. It started out real bad and slow, and then gain momentum toward the end of the year. So he's starting at the bottom, and then it's going to go that way. But I am privileged. I'm so excited about what's happening here at Frazer. I know I'm a little behind the times, particularly in music. My order of worship said Beth Mason violinist. That didn't look like a Beth Mason, and that didn't sound like a violinist, but I tell you, Frazer, we're blessed to have one of the finest organists anywhere in Tim Wilson. And in the music, and one of the best things you've done is bring Neil Epler on board, and it's a privilege, and I'm always blessed when I come. Tim Thompson is one of the best preachers. I love coming, Lynn and I do, to this service, and then also to the contemporary, Patrick Quinn. We're just blessed here at this church with two tremendous preachers, and I'm excited about what you've done. Last week, you had a special offering for building a church in Haiti. Now, during Christmas, you've taken a Methodist children's offering, you did the shoebox ministry, you did the angel ministry, you did your regular giving, and then you were challenged to give $145,000 to build a church in Haiti. And I was so excited to read that you had exceeded the goal, and this week even further, over $150,000. I'd say to you, there are no limits to what God can do in this church. And when we're open to it and where God wants to lead, and you've got every part of leadership on board here. And so the new members, the growth, it's exciting to see what's happening, to be a part of it. I have a leadership ministry. I sort of represent you. I'm always introduced as former pastor at Frazer. I have a website, and it's listed on the outline in the bulletin, and I would encourage you to go to it. In a couple of days, I'm going to sort of give a recap of what this ministry was involved in during 2011. I feel an accountability to you. I've had an opportunity this past year to over 2,800 pastors and lay folks to give training. I wish you would be praying God's opened even bigger doors for this next year. There's some of these little brochures here, some in the back and also out in the foyer if you're interested in that ministry. Also, I post a blog, a devotional each week. Now, this morning I'm going to refer to 2 or 3 of the things that are written on those blogs this past year, and you can go to the website, or if you give me your email address, we'd be glad to mail them to you. I hope you'll be praying. God's opened so many doors for 2012. This next week I'll be in North Carolina, and the next week I'll be in Tennessee and also in Arkansas, but the next week I'm going to be in Orlando. And I've been a part of a leadership team trying to reach the world to start 5 million churches. And we have pastors from 38 different countries of the world who will be there. And what an opportunity God has given in a multi-denominational, interracial type witness to the world. So I covet your prayers, and I thank you so much for them. Now, we're talking about God's game plan today. Now, I want to ask you to please take a pen or a pencil, and I want to ask you to make some notes. I've spent some time trying to put some words together so they would be easy for you to remember, not just today, but throughout the year. And if you'll take notes there, would you stand and join me in the reading of the scripture, which comes from Matthew 12, 1 and 2, and you have it printed there in your bulletin. Let us read together. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily hinders our progress. Let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, on whom our faith depends from start to finish. May God add His blessing to the reading, the hearing, but most important, our application of His Word for our lives. You may be seated. We have a lot of big athletic events at this time of the year. The National Championship football game in about 9 days. We'll have the Super Bowl. Following that will be the Final Four. And then we get into baseball and the World Series and the Masters Golf. There are a lot of big athletic events. If you want to know the biggest athletic event to which the Bible refers, you just read it a moment ago. They didn't have football or basketball, but it was the race. It was where people would compete by running. Now, they built stadiums sometimes that would seat as many as 70,000 people. And athletes would give their whole lives training. This is where the idea of the Olympics came. Now, any good athletic team before it enters a contest has a game plan. No team goes in without a game plan. Last year, Auburn had a good game plan in the national championship game. It was very simple. Snap the ball to Cam Newton and get out of the way. I mean, just a pretty good game plan. I would suggest we'll be pulling for Alabama in about 9 days. Hey, the best game plan is you got a guy named number 3. Give him the ball. Let him run left, let him run right, run up the center, especially when you cross the 40-yard line. But Alabama will have a great game plan for that. Game plans are important. Now, this morning, 2012, not a single day has been lived. I love this day. What a day to look at God's game plan for us for this year. If you could almost picture, 2012 is like a blanket of fallen snow, freshly fallen. There's not a single mark on that snow. We hadn't made any mistakes much yet this year. How can I be a winner? How can I be successful at what God's called me to do to accomplish His purpose? I want us to look at this game plan, and if you would walk through it with me, there are 4 simple parts to it. Now, I guarantee you, money back, if you'll follow this game plan, then 2012 will be your best year that you've ever lived. Now, there are 4 parts to it. Number 1, select your base. It's about partnerships. Select your base of support. Select the base of people that you want to surround you. Look at verse 1. We are surrounded by a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith. Now, in that race, whenever the runner would run, they were reminded, hey, everybody in this stadium is going to be pulling for you. They're cheering for you. You know, in football, in the Southeastern Conference, when you play on your home field, they say it's worth at least 3 points because most of the folks are cheering for you. In professional football, they say it's worth 4 points to play on the home field. You see, on the home field, everybody is for you. Now listen, if Satan ever gets you into a mindset where you feel like, hey, nobody's for me, I'm in this by myself. If Satan ever gets you isolated where you think you're the only one facing this, he'll whip you every time. But let me tell you what Satan can't deal with. It's a crowd of witnesses. Now, this is twofold. If you read the chapter just before this, it talks about the heroes of faith who are cheering for you. Abraham, Isaac, Moses, Jacob. Think about the folks that are for you. You've got a church that's for you. Let me suggest a couple of things. Number 1, pick your base. Select it. Be sure you pick some people. Don't try to do it by yourself. When I was a senior in high school, on this day, New Year's Day, I had an experience I'll never forget. I'd come down to Montgomery and I'd spoken at a youth event on New Year's Eve here in Montgomery. I was going back to Opelika to watch the football games on January the 1st. And the guy I stayed with carried me out. In those days, you could hitchhike. It was safe. I didn't have any money, didn't have a car, so I had to hitchhike. And he let me out up there on Highway 80 going back to back to Opelika, about where Capitol Heights Junior High School is. And let me tell you, back in those days, folks didn't travel on New Year's Day. Have you ever been hitchhiking when nobody was going your way? And I walked for about 30 minutes. Finally, a fellow picked me up and said, I'm not going far. He brought me right out here to where the Eastern Bypass is, dropped me off. I started walking right past where we are now. Finally, after about an hour, a guy picked me up and he said, I'm not going far, carried me out to Shorta. Dropped me off, and then another guy picked me up and carried me to Tuskegee. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was still in Tuskegee, and the ball games were starting. It also started to rain. Less folks won't pick you up if it's raining. And I sat out there in Tuskegee for about an hour. Finally, a fellow picked me up and carried me out to what's known as the Y. You know, where the road forks and goes to Phoenix City. or goes on to Opelika, and I sought some shelter, stuck my thumb out front. Nobody was going my way. Finally, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a bread truck. Fellow said, tell you what, I'm going to Auburn. If you want to stop at a few places, get in the truck. So I got in his bread truck with him. We stopped at every little grocery store that there is between Tuskegee and Auburn. Finally, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I got to Auburn, and I said, I'm calling my daddy. I said, come over to Auburn and pick me up, and I'd already missed all the ball games. That was one of the loneliest New Year's days I've ever spent. I felt like nobody was going my way. I want to say to you, part of God's game plan is don't ever get isolated. Don't ever feel that way. Select people. Select the folks who are going to encourage you. Paul says, pick folks that are going to build you up. You're playing on the home court of the home field. You saw something this past week. On Sunday, I read an article. It was about the quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, Drew Brees. They were asking him about some of the success that he had, and he said, listen, the success I have is because I have a group of teammates that encourage me. I'm grateful for those linemen that block for him and tell me, Drew, you can do it. And for good receivers. But he said, most of all, the thing that changed my life was my coach, Sean Payton. He said, I didn't come into the league as very high profile. But he told me, he said, you're going to be a star. And he said, Coach Payton saw in me things I didn't see in myself. And he called it the confidence level that was raised enormously. And he has become one of the greatest quarterbacks. And if you were watching football Monday night, I stayed up till about 11 o'clock. He had an opportunity to break a record in professional football that had lasted for 27 years. Most passes, yards completed with yards passed in the history of pro football. About 11 o'clock, I was getting a little sleepy. Boy, I was going to see if he could make it. And if you were watching with about 2 minutes to go, they were on the 9-yard line. He needs 7 yards. And he threw the pass in the end zone, and Sproles caught it. All of a sudden, the whole Superdome erupted. They stopped the game. They gave him the game ball. If you watch the interviews after today, Drew Brees holds the record for the most yards ever gained by passing in professional football. Again, when they interviewed him after, did you see it? He wouldn't take any credit. He talked about the coach that instilled confidence. He talked about the encouragement of the team. Let me tell you, friends, you can't beat being around folks who encourage you. Now, your game plan is select your base. Pick folks who are going to help you succeed, and pick folks who can see in you what you can't even see in yourself. So you begin by select your base. Say that with me. Select. Now let's try that again. Say it with me. Select your base. Now the second thing is start your race. When you select your base, then you start your race. And look what he says in verse 1. Strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily hinders our progress. You see, when runners would train, they always wore weights. And when you put on weights, and they would practice with these weights on their ankles, and you practice with weights on your ankles, what it does, it builds up the muscle in your leg and the endurance in your lungs. And you practice with those weights. Now, they're hard to fool with. When you put those weights on and you start running, it's hard to run, but you try it. He said, now, if you get ready to start the race, what's the first thing you do? You're not practicing. You're running. What did he say? Take them off. Don't leave them on. You'll never win a race running when you got weights on your ankles. Take them off. You know what I'll do? I'll challenge. I think I'll do this. I'm 73 years old. I've had a hip replacement. I'll challenge any athlete in the state of Alabama to a 100-yard dash this week. And I guarantee you I'll beat them if they'll put 30 pounds of weights on each ankle. I guarantee it. I'll make that challenge. I'll tell you another challenge I'll tell you. If you try to run with a weight on your ankles and he calls it the sin. You try to run the race of life with sin, Satan will beat you every time. There's not a better way to start 2012 than with a clean slate. He said, take off the weights. Now don't, sometimes we say, well, I'm not that bad. Or when something happens, we tend to blame people. I don't know if you read this past week on Wednesday, the New York Times sent out 8 million emails telling people that their subscription had been canceled. Now, when they found out, because they started getting phone calls, their immediate reaction was, that didn't come from us. But people started delving into it, and it did. So their second thing, instead of admitting their guilt, they said, somebody hacked into our system. But they discovered that didn't happen. And then thirdly, they said, it must have been a disgruntled employee. And then after about 4 hours, they finally said, we made a mistake. Please forgive us. Let me tell you about life. You can blame people for what you've done. You can transfer, you can rationalize. It's not. The only thing to do is to confess. In John 1:9, 1 John 1:9, it says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Let me tell you the game plan. When you start the race, take off the weights. Now, when you take them off, leave them off. Don't take them partially. If you got weights on both ankles, don't take it off just one. Dr. John Klein tells about a young girl who was a sprinter, and her father was timing her one day, and she had been practicing with her weights. And when he timed her, her time was very, very slow. He said, what is the matter? She said, well, I forgot to take my weights off. He said, well, you can't run the race. I can't get a good time with weight. Take them off. Now let's try it again. And he timed her again. She took the weights off, and again, her time was very slow. He said, I don't understand this. In the 100 meters, it's too slow. Where are the weights? She said, well, right here in my hands. You don't take them off your ankles and still hang on to them. Let me tell you the most therapeutic thing that can happen. Strip off the weights. Before you go into this year, whatever it is that might be a problem, if you got problems with people, get it right. If you've sinned and nobody else knows about it, confess it. Unconfessed sin is like food you leave in the refrigerator for a long time. It starts to stink. 2012 is a good time just to start off on January the 1st. I'm going to clean out the refrigerator. I'm going to confess. I want a clean slate. Let me ask you, if I ask you a sports trivia question, who is the quarterback who is the only person ever to play football who's quarterbacked a team in the Rose Bowl, the Super Bowl, and the Grey Cup Bowl, Canadian football? Only one person's ever done that. And to follow that up, you remember a great football game a few years ago, and they replay it all the time because it was when California was playing Stanford, and Stanford had the game won, and on the last play when they kicked the ball, remember California started lateraling, and every time a guy would get tackled, he'd lateral to somebody else and finally all of a sudden they went down the field, and the Stanford band was out on the field. The last guy to get the lateral ran over a band member and into the end zone, and Cal upset Stanford. Who was the coach at Cal? You don't remember, do you? But let me tell you one other incident that occurred 6 weeks ago. I bet you'll know his name. You see, they're having a big banquet. They were raising money for Canadian Football League players who had had concussions. And that quarterback who had coached quarterbacked in the Super Bowl and the Rose Bowl and the Canadian Cup was Joe Kelp. But you don't remember him for doing that. But during that banquet, there was a guy who 48 years ago he got in a fight with. And for 48 years he's carried a grudge. And for 48 years he's told everybody how bad Angelo Mosca is. And you've seen the YouTube, you've seen it on television 6 weeks ago. Joe Kelp took a flower off the decorations of the table and went over and said something smart to Angelo. Now remember, they're both 73 years old. Angelo can't even walk. He's on crutches, on a walking stick. And then he said something smart to him, and Angelo took his walking stick and hit Cap across the face with it. And Cap went over, and this man sitting there in the whip, he cold-cocked him, knocked him off the stage. And they said, why don't you guys make up? And they said, we'll never make up. Now, I don't want to be remembered for always holding a grudge. He could be remembered as one of the greatest quarterbacks, two distinct things, and as a coach. Can I just say to you, when you've done something wrong, strip off the weights. To start the race, take care of that matter. Not only are we involved in looking at what we're called to do, strip off the weight. So say that with me. First is select your base. Say that. And secondly, start your race. You think we can say them together? Let's try it. Select your base, start your race. Now here's the third thing. Sustain your pace. You got to sustain it. Life isn't just lived on a day or a week or a month. It's over the long haul. Look what he says in verse 1. Run with endurance the race that God has set before us. Now, the race isn't easy. I can tell you about 2012. I don't know what it's going to hold for you, but it's not going to be easy. You're going to have some challenges. You're going to have some tough times. But let me tell you, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. If the going gets tough and you fold, then you're defeated. But he said, when you run with endurance. Overcome the obstacles. It might be too hot when you're running. You might have a blister. The competition might be too. Run with endurance. Now let me tell you an interesting thing. Follow me carefully. In running with endurance, sometimes we complain about the circumstances. And if you complain about circumstances, you'll be defeated. He didn't say complain. He said run with endurance and overcome the circumstances. One day, Jesus was on a boat and there was a storm. And the disciples, their request to Jesus was, Jesus, get us out of this storm. Jesus didn't take the disciples out of the storm. He took the storm out of the disciples. Now, I dare you this year, when you got a tough time, don't pray, God, get rid of this circumstance. You can pray that, but also say, pray, God, how are you going to use me to overcome this circumstance? Now, let me tell you an interesting thing. What you think is bad might really turn out to be pretty good. You see, what we complain about sometimes is the very thing that's used. Circumstances should never dictate how we live. It's how we approach and deal with our circumstances. There was an old farmer. He had a mule. And there was an abandoned well on his property. And one day the old mule fell in the well. And the farmer had no way of getting the mule out of the well. And the mule was sort of old, so he just decided I needed to fill up the well anyway. So he called in all of his neighbors, and they brought in dirt. And he said, we'll just bury the mule and fill up the well at the same time. So they took the dirt and started throwing it down in the well. Old mule is down there. When he hits him on the back, he didn't know what they were doing. He just kicked off all the dirt and stepped up on the dirt. And they put in more dirt. He shook it off, stepped up on the dirt. They continued that for several hours until finally they filled up the well with dirt. All the mule knew how to do was to shake it off and step up. And finally, when the well was full of dirt, the mule stepped out of the well, and he was okay. You see, the very thing that they thought would bury him became the very thing that was his release to get free. I'll tell you about life. When something tough happens, what you think is so tough might be not a burden, but a blessing. It might not be a stumbling block. It might be a stepping. It might be the very thing God wants to use to help you out. So I just tell you, God's game plan is sustain the pace, endure. Back in 1881, a great educational institution, William and Mary, was closed. You see, the Civil War had been fought all around it, and much of the campus had been devastated. The students and faculty had left. And so William and Mary was closed. But they had a president named William Ewell. He did an interesting thing. Even though there was no faculty, no students, when it rained, the water came through the buildings that had been damaged so much during the war. Let me tell you what he did every day. Every morning he'd go over to the chapel and he would take the chapel bell and he would ring it. Every morning he would ring that bell. And people said, you don't have a faculty. You don't have any students. You hardly have any buildings. And 7 years later, William and Mary opened its doors and became vibrant again. I'd like to just make a suggestion to you. I dare you to just take your little bell and put it somewhere at your house. And this next year, when you face something, oh man, this is tough. Somebody says, you're not going to get through this business situation. You got an illness. It's the sound of hope. I just would challenge you, maybe there's a practical way to deal with it. Get your bell. You don't have to get one this big. Actually, I hate to tell you this, but this is a Baptist bell. I had to borrow it from the Baptist church. I dare you get your bell and ring it. So sustain your pace. Could you say them with me just to start with? The first thing is select your base. The second is that you start your race. Sustain your pace. And then the last thing, seek his face. Look at what verse 2 says. Keep your eyes on Jesus, on whom your faith depends from start to finish. There's only one way to live every day, and that's to keep your eyes focused on him. Remember Peter in that boat? And when he stepped out and started walking on the water, he did okay, as long as he looked at Jesus. Then all of a sudden he looked down and saw all these waves, and he started going under. Let me tell you a simple principle. The game plan is don't look at the circumstances. Don't look at what other folks might see. Instead, keep your eyes on Jesus. Look to him. At a college campus up north, the basketball team had to come back during the holidays to practice. And it was this dead week, right after Christmas to New Year's. They were the only ones on campus. They got up one morning, and when they had eaten breakfast, they walked back across the football field, and a beautiful blanket of snow had fallen the night before. Nothing had touched the snow, 100 yards on the football field. So these guys just thought, we've got a couple hours before practice. Let's see, who can walk the straightest line across the snow? See what kind of trail you can leave. And they started making a few wagers, and so one guy said, I'll give it a try. And this is what he decided to do. He decided to take 10 steps and then look back, and if it wasn't straight, he would correct his course. In 10 steps, he would correct again. At the end of the snow, all you could see were footprints. You could see them there. 10 yards, corrected 10 yards, 10 yards difference. Well, the first man saw that. The second guy saw it. So he said, instead of doing that, I'm just going to look back where I've been and keep one foot in front of the other. So he walked 100 yards like that. And when he looked back, there was a big arc. The third guy saw both of these, and he said, I'm not going to go 10 yards and correct. And I'm not going to go looking back. He looked across the football field, and he saw a pine tree that was sticking up above the stands, the tallest thing he could see. So he put his eyes on the top of that tree, and he started walking straight towards it. Never looked down, never looked to the left or the right, but walked straight towards that top of that tree. And when they looked back, his path was as straight as an arrow. I promise you, during this year, if you'll put your eyes on Jesus, Wayne sang it so beautifully a moment ago. if we crawl to Jesus, or walk to Jesus, or run to Jesus, or fly, or dance to Jesus, put your eyes on the face of Jesus. Seek His face more than anything else. And don't look to the right or to the left, and don't look back, but keep moving forward. And the path that you make for 2012 will be straight and will be in the center of God's purpose. A game plan. Athletic teams always have a game plan. I would just omit this one from Hebrews. Now, not a day has been ruined. Not a day has been wasted yet. Would you be willing to buy in to God's game plan? Would you say it with me, the 4 things? See if we can say it together. Select your base, start your race, sustain your faith, and seek His